The Soviet Union literally said, "We are real socialism." He famously said to Nixon, "We will bury you and we'll catch up with the Americans." And the Soviet leadership was like, "We cannot do that." You had an ideology that inherently put some strange utopia and ideal above what people actually wanted. Washing machine, and there it is. That is the reason the Soviet Union fell.
Hello and welcome to the Institute of Economic Affairs. I'm Daniel Freeman. This is the last in our three-part series on the rise and fall of the Soviet economy. Last time we dealt with Stalin. Today we're dealing with the fall of the Soviet Union from Khrushchev on. As always, I'm delighted to be joined by Aymen Aulaiwi, who is a DPhil student at Lincoln College, Oxford, and is the author of a very long but very good IEA Substack piece on just this topic, which you can find a link to in the description. So, Aymen, for your third article, you decided to call it The Indomitable Power of the Washing Machine. Why that title?
Well, that's a very good question. So it actually all spans from a bit of personal experience, because when I was, so this was before the war, I believe this was in 2019. I was traveling across Russia with a good friend of mine from the Netherlands, actually. And we were traveling across Russia, and of course we went in with lots of big expectations, you know. And having studied a lot of Russian and Soviet history, I think one of my biggest ones was to essentially hear that a lot of people missed the Soviet Union, right? Because the chaos of the 90s, the Wild West capitalism, the loss of global prestige, the loss of security, social security like public health care and free childcare. And so that was my expectation going in. And so we would go on these long train journeys and we'd start talking to these Russians because we'd share these little carriages of four in the second class seats. And I soon found all my preconceptions broken down. Because, there's actually a lot of evidence to suggest that a lot of Soviets do miss the Soviet Union. A lot of Russians miss the Soviet Union. I think a Levada Center poll in 2018 found like 66% of people regretted the fall of the Soviet Union. And so I thought, well, they're going to miss it. But, slowly through my interactions with these Russians, usually with either sign language, really bad Russian on my side, really bad English on their side, or a mix of schoolboy German from both our sides, because they're all forced to learn German instead of English at school, because it's, they were having a comradeship with their German, East German communists. I soon found out that preconception wasn't entirely true, and that probably a lot of the yearning for the Soviet Union was a lot more to do with that kind of vague concept of nostalgia, or as they call it in sort of the Soviet sense, ustalgia, Eastern nostalgia, which actually I think comes from German. So yeah, nostalgia. Yes, absolutely. So so I would have these conversations, and the one that really stood out to me was one with a lovely Russian woman called Tatiana. And so I was in this carriage car with my friend, and there was another guy from Sweden. There was a young Russian couple who spoke perfect English, and I was talking to Tatiana, who was essentially born in the Soviet Union, went to study economics at her local university, which, by the way, when you studied economics in the Soviet Union, had a very different meaning. It was sort of mixed in with management, science, and it was obviously taught mostly Marx and, command economy stuff. And she'd worked in a lot of factories during the Soviet Union. So I asked Tatiana, and this, by the way, is a reflection of the general response I got, which was, Tatiana, do you miss the Soviet Union? And she looked at me, and understanding the question I'd asked, she said, Нет, нет, нет. Потому что, because, in her very bad English, when the Soviet Union fell, we got a lot of, and then she couldn't find the word. So me and my friend, we're jumping in our seat. You know, by the way, we're all drunk out of our minds, and so we're drinking vodka on this guy's seat.
Well, we were Russian trains, you need to be.
Exactly. I mean, there's a funny joke I'll link to that. But so we're sort of shouting all the ideas we think it could be because, you know, we had this very Western mindset. So we're like, liberty, democracy, freedom. And then she just goes, because she's finally gotten the word after talking to the young Russian couple. Washing machine. And there it is. That is the reason the Soviet Union fell. I mean, I'm not literally saying the Soviet Union fell because of a washing machine, but what the washing machine represents, which in this specific case is a consumer good that not only could the system not provide, so there's that problem because you're like, oh, it's a consumer good that can't be provided, but it's also a consumer good that holds so much promise, more specifically for women, who it's a labor-saving device, right? Because you're getting a washing machine, you're not scrubbing clothes, suddenly I have free time to develop my sense of self, to decide what choices I want to make. And essentially what my theory for why the Soviet Union fell, which I think has a consensus block within the historical field, but it's much more along that socioeconomic line, which is that it's not only the system's incapacity with the Stalinist command economy that they continued using to produce consumer goods that made the Soviet Union fall. It was also the fact that those consumer goods were being linked to people's sense of identity and want. And that was helped by the fact that suddenly they had increasing freedom during the late Soviet period to express themselves as individuals. And that really started with Khrushchev. So Khrushchev comes in, following the fall after the death of Stalin. Yeah. By the way, if anyone wants to understand what happened at the period of the death of Stalin, the film is fantastic. I have no gripes with the film. Armando Iannucci. It's a great film. It's a great film. Yeah. And essentially, despite all the wrangling between these figures like Beria and Khrushchev, who's excellently played by Steve Buscemi, and
I don't think he's fat enough. I think you need more of the sort of...
Hollywood is always going to put a bit of a tinge on how people look. You know, they'll probably get Paul Mescal playing Lenin if there's ever a biopic. So it will never be quite true. But I think... but what you do see all these things, and Melenkov as well, who's played by Jeffrey Tambor, they're all wrangling to see who can liberalize the system first. Because they inherently know that what happened under Stalin, especially the coercive elements, were bad. But despite wanting a lot of positive changes, which is reducing the amount of coercion and trying to increase the amount of production of consumer goods and to increase prices of grain for buying off the collected, the kolkhozes, which were these collectivized farms, they ultimately still, all of them, subscribe to the idea that the command economy and collectivization is good. So suddenly it opens these two different simultaneous doors in the Soviet Union. One is that they're saying they're going to gear the command economy towards consumer goods. So they've made a promise to the Soviet people that we are going to improve your living standards and give you the consumer goods that you've always wanted. Yeah. But within a command economy, that's very bad at that. The second is this thaw, you know, and this is famously comes about with the 1956 secret speech by Khrushchev, which was something like on the cult of personality and its consequences. And here, you know, he openly says that what a lot of Stalin did was bad. Yeah, and this starts a process of de-Stalinization where the culture and what people can say has been suddenly really liberalized, right? And it's a very confusing moment for the Soviets because all these citizens who had basically become coerced into believing Stalin was a good man because, you know, it's this kind of Stockholm syndrome, they're suddenly being told that he wasn't. And that all those family members they lost during the purges were actually innocent. Well, not all of them, but, you know, they say, you know, people started questioning. Many of them. Yeah. Well, I mean, sorry, may I put this? They were all innocent. Well, But they didn't think all of them were in. You know, they were still. They didn't necessarily say that it was.
Some you had to wait until the late 80s before
they said it was
formally. Yeah.
And so it becomes this very confusing process. So you have this simultaneous thing opening up. And initially, Khrushchev's quite successful, especially during the liberalisation, because people like that, you know. So you get, you know, so this is now the late 50s and the 60s, rock and roll. Very exciting, you know. During the 56, I think it's the World Festival of Youth. You get all these young people coming, all these young socialists coming into Moscow. And suddenly these people are seeing Levi, you know, jeans, and they're sneaking in this band called the Beatles, and well, probably not 56, but you know, Elvis, you know, and suddenly this seems like a very exciting time, and you do get some really cool Russian culture coming and Soviet culture coming through at this period. You know, the film industry and music industry in Russia is really in Soviet Union is really taking off. You have singers like Muslim Magomаев, who famously did the song that became a meme on YouTube. I can't let him do it.
Oh,
but it's the singing Russian guys.
Yeah,
and you get films like The Adventures of Shurik, which are sort of like these sort of comedy films, famously
kidnapping Caucasian
Asian style.
Very good film.
Very good film. Yeah. You can watch them on YouTube. On Mosfilm, which is very good. That you can watch those, and of course the most famous, which every Russian watches on New Year's, which is Ivan Vasilyevich changes profession.
Yeah.
So there's that social side. It's opening up. There's more freedom, and you know you get sort of really daring pieces of literature like. One Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich by Solzhenitsyn, which is in this critique of the Gulag system and built under Stalin. Some things go a little too far. I think it's Pasternak's Dr. Zhivago, which was banned, and he wasn't allowed to collect his Nobel Prize in Literature because of it. Which is
so we have this process of political liberalization,
and
does this filter into the economic approach that Khrushchev takes?
So in the economic approach, there is no serious consideration about completely rejigging the command economy, right? There was some reform attempts under Ordzhonikidze during the mid-30s before Stalin purged him, and there would later be in the mid-60s. But ultimately, the foundations of the command economy and how we described it in the last video is essentially the same structure. The only thing they're doing is they're slightly tweaking the priority principle to say, actually want to produce more consumer goods.
Yeah.
And there is a big change There's a big change, though, in agriculture. But once again, not to the sense that it's being that they're getting rid of collectivization. What they're actually doing is they want to essentially increase the amount of land that is being collectivized and is under cultivation, which is called the Virgin Lands Campaign. So he goes into northern Kazakhstan and southern Siberia and says, we could plant here. And he's even more crazy, Khrushchev, and these are called harebrained schemes by his detractors, because after a visit to the US in 1959, he got subdued to what I could only call a craze for maize, because he was just obsessed with corn.
Yeah.
I mean, look,
I've seen some very good pro-corn propaganda coming out.
There is
Khrushchev.
But if you know anything about Russian soil, corn is not what you plant in Russian soil. And so, essentially, this agricultural policy just collapses. And as a result, in 1962, there's this sudden 30% hike in meat, butter, and milk prices, which essentially leads to something called the Novocherkassk massacre, where people go out and protest against this price rises. 20 people get shot, huge outcry in the country, which that symbolizes a very different change from Stalinism already, because suddenly people are protesting because the consumer goods and things are on the shelves at a reasonable price. Suddenly people are able to respond to their shortages because they've been promised consumer welfare.
Yeah.
And on top of that, they're suddenly able to express themselves. Because after if the Novocherkassk massacre happened under Stalin, one, the number would be much higher.
Yeah.
But two, no one would be able to talk about it. It'd be considered they would have been considered spies, and they were, but now suddenly people felt very critical of this. So that was on the agriculture side. And in industry, and also sort of he tried to introduce some other ideas. He created the Sovnarkozy, which was supposed to kind of be the sort of regional social balance, but it just added another layer of problems. It's like starting a quango, right? Because you're just sort of adding another layer of government, which causes more complex.
Extra committee who have to be consulted, and it actually seemed to jam up the process more than anything else.
Yeah. So despite some good harvests in the early 50s, in the mid to late 50s, which are mostly because it's the first time you're growing in this virgin land soil, so it's great, and then suddenly all the nutrients are gone, and boom, gone, right? So, and also the harvests just get worse, right? Because the weather doesn't do what you want it to do. So agricultural output decreases again. They're producing more consumer goods. They're producing more housing. Yeah. You have what's known as the Khrushchev, which is just actually because, so they produce all this housing. It's great. People are finally getting housing. Why are they called the Khrushchev? Khrushchev plus Khrushchev, which means slum. Because these houses are prefab, right? Yeah. They're very poorly built. They're 4 to 5 stories. And, much like the social housing that was produced in Britain in the 60s and 70s, nobody really wants to live there. Yeah. Unless you're Mark and Jeremy from Peep Show, whatever. So there is this, the promise of more consumer goods is being fulfilled, but expectations have been raised so high. Yeah. And that's why Khrushchev ultimately gets removed. Yeah. Because it is the people within the Politburo who say, look, you're setting expectations way too high. Yeah. And specifically 3 episodes, I think, does this. Or you can even do 4. If we go into the 4th one, it's the Cuban Missile Crisis, right? Because, he backed down. And, it didn't look like a very strong move when he pulled out the nukes from Cuba. But the first one was in the UN in 1960, that famous slamming of the shoe, which was actually against, I believe, the Indonesian delegation, maybe the Filipino delegation, because they'd criticized the Soviet Union for being imperialist. And he said, oh, yes, but you are just American imperial subjects. But, they were all thinking, look, 4 years ago, we totally, during the Hungarian uprising in 1956, we were clearly very imperialist. So don't say that. It makes us, it looks too contradictory. The second was in 1959 when he visited the US and he got the craze for maize. He famously said to Nixon, who was the vice president, in 15 years, by 1970, we will bury you and we'll catch up with the Americans. And the Soviet leadership was like, we cannot do that. We cannot catch up with the Americans in technological advancement. And the third was because he promised and he said that they would achieve communism by 1980.
As in full communism.
Full communism, state would dissolve, no money, from each according to his ability to each according to his need. And they were like, not only is that virtually impossible, but they didn't really want it. Yeah. So what replaces Khrushchev is Brezhnev.
Very different man.
A very different man. Yeah. Besides his miraculously bushy eyebrows, which exude paternal charm, which is a phrase I use in the article. He is essentially a social conservative in the socialist sense. Yeah. He doesn't want change. Now, in 1965, there's some changes brought in by his economics minister, Kosygin, which is basically just taking back a lot of the bad, harebrained ideas that Khrushchev brought in, like getting rid of the Sovnarkozy. And there is some attempt to make businesses the enterprises to work on a more cost accounting method, but still the command economy stays in place.
Yeah. As I understand it, in theory, businesses are supposed to state-run industries are supposed to turn a profit, but still all of the prices are set by the state, and also they have their own output quotas. So
it doesn't really apply in many ways, right? So it's essentially a continuation of the system. And what's miraculous about the Brezhnev era, which lasts from around 1964 till his death in 1982, so it's a huge swathe of Soviet history, is if you look at polls of Russians, he is considered the most popular Soviet leader. And he is considered and it is considered the best time. So it's called like a golden age.
Yeah.
So it's quite funny how in the time where they did absolutely nothing, no convulsive campaigns, no systems of mass purges, that was the moment that people actually saw the system most favorably, right? And I think that's sort of speaks to the main critique of the Soviet Union, which is that, actually the bits where it was at its best was when they were trying to not achieve socialism and communism, and they were just sort of happy with the system. So it becomes this period known as mature socialism or actually existing socialism, but even more funny, real socialism. The thing that the left always say, oh, no, that's not what the Soviet Union was. The Soviet Union literally said, we are real socialism.
Yeah.
And it was literally the period where they said, well, we're just going to prioritize consumer welfare, provide public services, full employment, and we're basically going to let people live peaceful lives. There's going to be stability of the cadres. There's going to be no purges. Everyone's going to stay in
Everyone
office.
keeps their job. Doesn't matter if you're particularly good at your job, not good at your job. You're just going to keep...
It's beverage full employment, right?
Yeah.
It's very kind of it actually aligns much closer to our conceptions of the post-war consensus in Britain and in Western Europe, right? And what's really interesting is there was debates at the time, including a seminal economic historian of the period, Alec Nove, on whether you could consider the Soviet Union a welfare state. Right? So it became this very interesting system where they're suddenly moving from this Stalinist industrial drive to something towards more like a welfare state.
Yeah.
But at the same time, huge increases in military spending, eats up a lot of the gross national product.
Yeah. Well, and that seems to be an interesting aspect of this, because as we know, welfare states are really expensive, even in the ramshackle form that you get in the Soviet Union, as is military expenditure. And if the economy is not really being reformed, you still have this command economy that isn't functioning very well. How are they able to pay for this all?
So, funny enough, you would it was saved by fact. I mean, in the words of Macmillan, events, dear boy, events. And two events really help Brezhnev to pay for this system, right? Which is, one, the discovery of new oil fields in Siberia, which increases oil output by 45% from 64 to 70, suddenly followed by the 1973 oil price shock, where, following the Six-Day War in the Middle East, the
Yom Kippur War, right?
Yom Kippur War has many names. The OPEC, led by Saudi Arabia, decided to withhold oil output. So what happened was oil prices shot up, and suddenly the Russians were selling lots of oil. At the same time, because of how poor agriculture is, they're importing agriculture goods from abroad. So this big expanse of fertile soil, well, not in all places, but in a lot of places, is having to import from America and Canada and places like that, where they're actually able to be agriculturally productive. And so they're essentially paying through this oil price shock. So what becomes very interesting is that despite this sort of crisis, these problems that Khrushchev introduces, which is increasing personal freedom alongside the promise of consumer goods you can't provide, they're able to sort of hang on by providing this welfare state backed up by bumper oil profits. Another thing is that this actually surprised me when I first read it a couple of years ago, that you know what was the most profitable thing that they sold, that the command economy produced for the Soviet economy?
Other than oil.
Other than oil, for domestic consumption.
Vodka.
Yeah. By 1985, vodka was 17% of government revenues.
What, just from selling vodka?
Yeah. Producing and selling vodka. Because that is the only thing they were producing that met demand. Because actually people were so, disenchanted that they just drank themselves to death. The male the life expectancy goes down from 64 to 62.
I'm assuming that also didn't particularly help with, say, agricultural productivity.
Oh, no. On the farms, they were spending, I think by 1980, about a third of their money on vodka. So it was quite severe. But the system manages to hang on during the 70s, and it becomes what I would call a time of latent crisis. You had an interesting...
the Indian summer.
The Indian
of the
summer.
Soviet Union.
Because essentially you were able to maintain the system through, all right, there's some improvements in consumer goods production, there's vodka, you're expanding the welfare state.
Selling oil, we're getting hard currency, we're buying all the consumer products we need from Canada and cultural stuff.
But then, why do I call it latent crisis? Because what starts developing from the 60s into the 70s is really the root of the collapse of the Soviet Union, which is that original point I was making about the washing machine, which is people have this more personal freedom and they start wanting these consumer goods that they've then been promised. And they're also being exposed increasingly to Western culture and Western films. You know that in Soviet Ukraine, by the mid-1970s, 80% of films showed in Soviet cinemas in Ukraine were Western films. You know,
including Star Wars.
Which was hugely popular, believe it or not.
Yeah.
I mean, believe it, because Star Wars is a great franchise.
Yeah.
Up to the end of the 70s. And that's my personal opinion anyway. But so suddenly people are, especially the young people, are starting to want consumer goods that they see in Western films, right? Or the Beatles are singing about, which by the way, they were legal, but many people smuggled them through things like Zamostat and Tamostat, which are sort of terms of either smuggled in goods or sort of reproduced goods. And they would even print the vinyl onto sort of old X-rays, and they'd call them ribs. It's very cool. And suddenly what was happening was they were sort of connecting their identity less with the sort of socialist society that was trying to be built. Like, you know, how under Lenin, you know, a lot of young people were indoctrinated to the sense that a lot of their self-identity came from this idea of they're trying to build social communism.
Yeah.
Now their identity is being built off like Western ideas, and well, not even Western ideas, Western music, Western culture, Western films, Western goods. You have people like the Stigali, which are like the teddy boys of the Soviet Union, who are wearing these colorful suits and want to be like the Beatles and whatever. You know, really interesting stuff. And what happens is the thing that really fills this gap for them is the growth of the second economy. So the second economy had always existed. And why do I use second economy instead of a black market? Because the second economy means it's just so much more pervasive. It's like you almost have to interact with it every day to survive. And it had already been existent under Stalin, not only for the average person. I think in a 1935 survey of workers, single workers in the Chitybyansk factory, they found that 72% of them bought their last pair of shoes off the black market. The second economy.
Rather than from a state.
From a state, because they could never make the right amount of shoes and all the shoes were the wrong size.
Yeah.
So the second economy was pervasive. And it was responding to this new consumer demand, right? And so historians like James Miller suggest that there was this little deal between the Brezhnev administration and the people, whereas they would say, look, you can go get all the consumer goods you want, like Tamostat, Zamostat, ribs, the vinyl, or even the best, you know, the most amazing Western good that everyone wanted, Levi's jeans, which, by the way, this is my dirty little secret, I like wearing jeans. It's kind of bad for an academic, but yeah. So it's responding, and they said, well, you can have those goods and we'll turn a blind eye, and what we'll do is we will you give us political loyalty.
Yeah.
However, I disagree with Miller. I think that in reality the Brezhnev administration had no control over what was essentially being wanted, what sort of consumer goods were being wanted, and how the second economy was working. So what happens is that increasingly the consumer goods they're wanting are being connected to something they don't have, and increasingly being aligned to the West. And so another historian called Alexei Yurchak suggests that he creates the concept of the imaginary West. This idea that actually these goods, it's not like young Soviets were actually saying, I want capitalism over communism. They're not really interested in that.
They just like the stuff.
They just like the stuff.
Produced.
They just like the stuff.
Yeah.
And you know, and they're dreaming of an imaginary West.
Yeah.
Right? And the imaginary West isn't actually the West. It's their fantasies of having all the stuff they want.
Yeah.
And what makes this worse is actually the Brezhnev administration, because they're reducing coercion, because they're becoming more liberal in many ways socially, they kind of indulge this in two ways. One, by giving official space for young people to indulge in these consumer goods and this new culture. So, for example, you have what is known as the Komsomol discotheques, which was the Komsomol were the youth league of the Communist Party. And they were allowed to open these discos where they could play ABBA and Bee Gees and stuff like that. But they were also forced to give out Soviet propaganda. But of course, no one read the propaganda. Yeah, everyone was just sort of dancing to the Bee Gees. So that's one thing, they're opening up this space. And two, the Soviet films that were made, like the Oscar-winning film of 1980, Moscow Doesn't Believe in Tears, they were also infantilizing them with consumer goods because they would show in these films full-stock shops, which didn't exist in reality, right? So there's like Adam Curtis's hyper-normalization, right? Like this idea that there's this huge disconnect between reality and the person. And my disagreement with Yurchak is that he sort of leaves it at that, right? He just says, oh, well, it's an imaginary West, right? It wasn't that they actually wanted the West. But when you get into the 1980s, where those goods become more and more, the shortage becomes more and more severe, when oil prices go down, they reduce by like a factor of 5 by the mid-80s. Yeah. And the technological differences of what they see in the West and here are becoming so big, it does become political. Because now they're saying, no, it's the system that means I can't get the consumer goods that I want, but also necessary for my sense of identity. And why was the washing machine the most important element? Because if you look at revolutions through history, and this is a very personal historical point of view, they are not determined by young people, dissidents. You know, as we saw with the Corbyn years, it is not young people who causes severe social change.
Yeah.
It is women. That's my view. The reason I say women, one, because they are a substantial amount of the population. They're 50%. In Russia, they're even more than 50% because of the loss of men during the Second World War. Yeah. But also women can usually convince their husbands to do things like vote in specific ways, women tend to actually control the sort of social, if there isn't sort of severe patriarchal domestic abuse going on, women tend to control the way that socially the household is going. But women were also ultimately at the forefront of the command economy because they're the ones doing all the shopping.
Yeah. And the queuing.
And suddenly, not only are they seeing that these goods are becoming more and more shorter, but also the goods that they want are not provided. And the good that obviously would have improved the lives of many women was the washing machine because it represents time liberated for the self. Yeah. It's self-choice. And so for me, that is how eventually, by the time we reach the 80s, the oil prices collapse. The command economy can no longer produce these things.
Yeah.
No washing machines, no cool consumer goods for young people.
This rising resentment from below.
Yeah.
But there's also, one of the interesting aspects is that, so Brezhnev dies in 1982, and then you have, Andropov, and then Churchenko, who everyone always forgets. Do
you know what? There's not even a good photo of him on his Wikipedia.
well, he lasts 6 months or
he didn't last long,
something like that.
Yeah.
Well, you have a series of very, very old men who die very quickly. But even in Andropov's case, there is sort of an acknowledgement at the top that something has to change, and that eventually is part of the reason why the system spits out Gorbachev as the new leader from the 1980s.
That famous birthmark. Yes, which my dad always reminds me of, because that's how he remembers him from his childhood. Right. And he also remembers Thatcher as the Mad Thatcher because that's what Saddam used to call her.
Oh, right.
Also, my dad's from Iraq. So Gorbachev comes in, and he's looking at the system, and he openly calls the Brezhnev era an era of stagnation. And you're right, a lot of this reforming mentality did come under Andropov as well. But actually, the first reforms they do is try and cut down on the vodka, which was terrible for state revenue. So it only made the situation worse economically. So he comes in and he recognizes a lot of this problem that is ultimately that the command economy needs reform to start producing those consumer goods that people want and to keep the system afloat. There's also a terrible war in Afghanistan that isn't going well, and people, finding out their children getting killed, they're coming back wounded. There's a lot of social strife. So he tries to attempt to create a lot of economic liberalizing reforms, and it's called perestroika, which in Russian roughly translated is restructuring. So they're restructuring the command economy or the economy to become much more liberal and able to adapt. And of course, that's also paired with glasnost, which means transparency, which is about making the government more transparent. And a lot of people see that as the start of the end of the Soviet Union, but linking back to Khrushchev, those policies are essentially mirrors of what he started, right? Economic re-angling towards consumer welfare and political liberalization. So he starts these. But more on perestroika, he introduces these key laws to start. So in 86, you have the law on individual labor activity, which allows for individuals to open their own stalls and markets. In 88, you have the law on cooperatives, which allows groups of people to form cooperatives, which, are independent businesses, but collectively owned. And so it's kind of this move to what a lot of people call like market socialism. And funny enough, people like Terry Eagleton in his book, Why Marx Was Right, which I had to read. Well, actually, I think when I read it, I was younger. I found it quite interesting. But now, I've grown up. Yeah. He claims that this is a viable alternative to the command economy because you ensure that there's no huge inequality through individuals. Everything is collectively owned, but you operate within a market system. However, what Terry doesn't recognize today and what Gorbachev didn't recognize then was market socialism has already really been in place in non-aligned Yugoslavia for tens of years. Yeah. And even in non-aligned Yugoslavia, the system was collapsing because ultimately competition wasn't very strong. There's a variety of factors why market socialism doesn't work.
I suppose do you also have an issue if there's a reluctance to allow large-scale operations like large-scale factories? You don't really get
with
economies of scale.
Scale, yeah, and obviously the modern corporation is the best at providing that sort of scale.
Yeah.
So essentially, Gorbachev's reforms are too little, too late. That's how I summarize them. And so by the late 80s as well, with his political liberalization, he tells those poor Eastern European countries that had been forced under socialist rule alongside the poor people of the Soviet Union who are forced under it, that you can go your own separate way. You have to be self-reliant. And of course, all by 89, they're like, yeah, screw this, we're off.
Yeah. And how, just on that point, actually, because in all of these interviews, we haven't actually touched on the Soviet Union's satellites in Eastern Europe. Do they play any role in the Soviet economy, or are they purely sort of military and political puppets and tools?
So no, they did play a large amount of role, especially with Comecon, which is sort of their enforced economic regime, which was kind of a response to I want to say the OECD, I believe, and the European Union, of course, as a sort of market area. And they would sort of be forced to trade with each other. But essentially, it became quite an exploitative system where, they would send cheap fuel and food, if they had any, to these countries. But they would essentially force the East Germans to produce typewriters and give it to them. So it was a very exploitative trade relationship, not too different to how we view colonial relationships in the 19th and 18th century, which Adam Smith obviously was very much against. So I think, it's a mostly exploitative role. And if you look at events like the 1956 Hungarian uprising or the Prague Spring in 68 under Dubček, who called for socialism with a human face, the Soviets were never fond on anyone really trying to break out of not only their sphere of orbit, whatever it is, but also break out of their economic model. And so, yeah, when it collapses in those countries, actually the Soviets feel exactly the same way. And of course, it is also tied to national independence movements within the outskirts of the Soviet Union, especially in Ukraine and Belarus. It's not as strong in Central Asia. That's mostly because this party was quite strong there. But in the Baltics as well. And that's why in 1991, it all collapses. But ultimately, it's because everyone feels the same thing, which is this system is not fulfilling its promises to give me the goods that I want, the indomitable power of the washing machine.
Yeah, that's so. As you understand the fall of the Soviet Union, it is primarily a sort of a reaction to economic promises unfulfilled, rather than a sort of drive towards democracy or liberty.
Yeah, no, I don't. And I think if you look at the history of Russia since, one of the so as opposed to the solidarity movement that came out of Poland or the movements for liberation from the communists in Czechoslovakia, later the Czech Republic and Slovakia, they were built largely on democratic basis, that they were calling for sort of democracy as a political point. However, in the Soviet Union, a lot of the anti-Soviet forces, while they did eventually settle on wanting a democracy, it was never a stronger point of that. It was much more about getting the washing machine, right?
Yeah.
And I think there's a lot of nuance in trying to I mean, the post-Soviet period is a very interesting period in itself. But I think, to summarize why I think the Soviet Union collapsed, it's not just because of Gorbachev's reforms. It's not just because of those two forces that Khrushchev releases. And it's not just because of Stalin's command economy that will never fulfill consumer welfare needs. It's ultimately because of what happened in 1917, which is that you had an ideology that inherently put some strange utopia and ideal above what people actually wanted. And I think that was always why the Soviet Union was going to collapse, because it was always built on the premise that you had to sacrifice something of yourself for some idea of the common good. And if history teaches us anything, that usually doesn't go down well.
Yeah. No, that's a really interesting point and a really interesting thought. I thought, as a kind of final question to round this up, many people point to other communist regimes, particularly in East Asia and South Asia, so take China and Vietnam, that though they remain autocratic states, did through the late 80s and especially in the 90s and early 2000s, did transition into market economies, and as part of that process managed to raise a lot of people out of poverty. Was there ever a possibility that the Soviet Union could have gone down that route?
I mean, there could have been. I think in the 80s... Huh?
Why didn't it?
Well, I think because it was too little too late. I think Gorbachev's reforms were too little too late. I think if you wanted to have that turn, it probably should have happened at the same time China did it. It was around the 70s and early 80s. But also, actually, the Soviet Union had existed much longer and probably had to happen in the 60s. But this goes back to the fundamental point I was trying to make. Look, as we can see now with the rise of China, they're clearly reaching some sort of supremacy in the world. But I fear that there will eventually be a breaking point where if you have this political draconian system, which is about suppressing people's wants and needs on a very individual self level, then eventually you will reach this sort of impasse moment. So it's interesting to see how far they can go with this kind of mixed model. But I suspect that much like the Soviet Union, maybe it could have made the Soviet Union last a bit longer. But that's a historical counterfactual that doesn't exist.
Yeah.
And I think my point, of course, I'm coming from this as an economic historian, but from a much more philosophical point of view, the reason a good economy works is how a good society works, which is when the individual is put first.
Yeah. Well, I think that's a very good note on which to end the third and final video in this series.
It's
So
been very fun. Thank you for having me on.
no, well,
I've really
thank you
enjoyed
for-
it.
And thank you so much for writing all 3 articles, which now, all 3 of them will now be up on the IEA's Substack, which you can find at insider.iea.org.uk. There is a link in the description. Really, really well worth reading. But other than that, thank you all for watching, and we will see you next time.